So you ran your 939 series 5-ton truck out of fuel. Today's video we're going to cover a couple things. First one, we'll go through the 939 series NHC 250 Cummins non-turbo variant and address how to prime the fuel system on this truck. The second half of the video we'll go through the A2 variant with the 8.3 liter turbocharged Cummins, and we'll address priming the fuel system on that truck. All right, before we get into the priming techniques, I do want to address a couple things about just the fuel system health on the truck and keeping up on your maintenance, being proactive instead of reactive with these trucks. So one of the things we've seen, having 150 plus 939 series 5-tons come through our shop, a lot of these trucks have algae buildup, corrosion inside the fuel tank strainers. And some of that's obviously biodiesel, tied to biodiesel. And then some of it is, a lot of it's just running the tanks low on fuel and allowing a lot of condensation in your fuel tanks. So ideally, keep your fuel tanks full. That'll minimize the condensation buildup and also minimize running out of fuel. The draw straw on these trucks don't go all the way to the bottom of the fuel tank. So one of the things I recommend is an 1/8 inch rod. You've got your fuel tank strainer, which has some holes in it. Just find a hole, drop that to the bottom of the tank, and you can actually physically see what you have for fuel. The fuel tank gauges in these trucks, trust like a politician, don't. So use one of these, verify what you actually have for fuel in your truck. You can obviously tie that to your gauge and see if it's accurate. All of the fuel gauges and sending units we carry, army6x6.com. Give us a call, we can help you there. One other thing when we're talking fuel tanks, make sure that you keep your fuel hoses in good shape. Being that these trucks did not come factory equipped with primer pumps or lift pumps, it's critical that you have an airtight fuel system. So keep up on your fuel lines, make sure that all the rubber's fresh and nice and airtight. One of the problematic areas we see on these trucks is the canister style fuel filter on these trucks. Often this gasket doesn't get installed correctly or has a cut in it. That will cause air in your fuel and obviously hard start issues or no start. So make sure that this is obviously installed correctly and updated. And again, all your fuel lines are fresh. So the tools that I would recommend for priming your fuel system on an 855 Cummins equipped 939 series 5-ton would be the following. One, nitrile gloves, some fuel resistant gloves. We're going to be using a funnel with a smaller neck that we can put inside the fuel line and fill with fuel. This is where the nitrile gloves come in handy. You're going to get fuel on your hands. Keep them safe. A crescent wrench, if you don't know what size your fuel line is on your truck. This particular truck we're working on today has a 1 inch. One thing to keep in mind is 939 series 5-tons, the majority of these trucks have been in civilian hands for over 10 years. So the likelihood of fuel lines being replaced over time, different size fuel lines, different adapters, don't just assume it's a 1 inch. We've seen lots of different sizes come through our shop. So again, the one we're doing today is a 1 inch. Do verify what size fuel line is on your truck, so the tools you put in your kit for roadside repairs are obviously correct. A Schrader valve tool, we'll talk about that for your canister style fuel element, and then a set of pliers depending on what your fuel canister looks like as well. So these are going to be the tools we'll need to prime the fuel system on a 939 series 5-ton, again with the NHC 250 Cummins non-turbo engine. So we went over the tools that I would recommend for priming the fuel system on an NHC 250. So once you have your fuel, the first step I would recommend on your fuel canister, which is underneath the driver's side, pretty much pedal cluster for the most part, is you've got two different style fuel elements, which we'll both go over. This particular one has a Schrader valve. So this is where your pliers would come in handy. And you'll open that Schrader valve. That allows us to bleed air out of the fuel system when we're trying to prime the fuel system. This is the other style element that you'll see on the trucks. Again, you'll notice some differences. This particular one does not have the petcock, and it has a Schrader valve on the top of the filter housing. So this particular one, this is where a Schrader valve removal tool comes in handy. You'll take that Schrader valve completely out, all the way out, and your cap, and I would highly recommend, you're probably in a bad situation if you ran out of fuel on the side of the road or whatever, put these in the cab so they don't blow away or get muddy, because naturally we're going to use those for the reinstall, and you want to make sure everything is clean. So again, we're going to take the petcock, open it if you have that style. If you have this style with the Schrader valve, you're going to take the Schrader valve completely out, and that's the first step. All right, so our next step, after we opened up our Schrader valve or petcock on our fuel canister filter for bleeding, we're going to go to the fuel line that comes from that canister fuel filter directly to the injection pump. So on this particular truck, like I noted on our tool layout, this particular truck uses a 1-inch wrench to take this fuel filter, this fuel line off the injection pump. Take a look at your truck and see what style you have. Don't assume you have a 1-inch. Again, over the years, people have modified these trucks. Verify what you have. So again, this particular truck has a 1-inch, but see what your particular truck that you're working on has. So 1-inch, you're going to take this fuel line off. Once you have that fuel line off, take a funnel and you'll put that inside the fuel line. Start adding diesel fuel into the fuel line, and you'll start looking where either the Schrader valve or the petcock is open, and you're going to start seeing diesel fuel coming out of those. Initially, you're going to have it with some air bubbles, and what you're going to look for is you want to see straight diesel fuel coming out. So once the air bubbles minimize or go away, that's what you want to see. Once you've hit that point, you're going to close that petcock or put that valve stem core back in the Schrader valve and tighten everything up. Next step is you're going to have this fuel line again, and since those are closed, you're going to add fuel once more, and this fuel line will be completely filled all the way to the top. Once you've hit that point, you're going to take this fuel line and hook it up to your injection pump, snug this line again. I highly recommend having lots of NHC 250s come through our shop, either 939 series variants and M939 series 5 tons. We are personally not a big fan of the primer pumps on this particular engine. They're fairly unreliable, and they also cause a lot of air intrusion problems. They're not a very airtight setup, so we actually removed these off trucks and cap on the injection pump. That'll eliminate a lot of heartburn situations. So again, fill this fuel line, put it back on your injection pump, snug that up, and go in your truck. You're going to give it about half throttle and start cranking, and it should fire off. And that'll get you up and running in an NHC 250 Cummins if you're on the side of the road, have minimal tools for the job, and you want to get your fuel system primed. Okay, so the first portion of the video, we talked about the NHC 250 Cummins. Now we're going to talk about priming the fuel system on an A2 939 series variant with the 8.3 liter C-Series turbocharged Cummins engine. So the tools we're going to need for this job: nitrile gloves, funnel with a smaller neck that'll fit inside the fuel line. This particular truck we're working on today has a 7/8 fuel line, 12 millimeter or a 10 millimeter wrench, and we'll go into that, and a Schrader valve removal tool. So again, these are the tools we're going to need for an A2 series 5-ton priming the fuel system scenario. So the first portion of this video, we went over the 855 Cummins powered trucks on how to prime the fuel system. This portion, the second half, is on the 8.3 liter turbocharged Cummins variants in the A2 series trucks. So again, if you ran the truck out of fuel and you have minimal tools to do the job, this is what we're going to talk about. So on the A2 variant, you have a canister style fuel filter element underneath the driver's floorboard, pretty much right underneath your pedal cluster. So on this particular truck, we have a Schrader valve on top of the fuel filter element. We're going to take that cap off. This is where our Schrader valve removal tool comes in handy. So we'll make sure everything's clean first off, and then take this Schrader valve completely out. So you'll take that Schrader valve, assuming that I took it out, and you'll put these in a clean area. If you're on the side of the road, put them inside the cab where they don't blow out, keep them clean, because you will use those for the reinstall. And obviously we need everything clean for everything to seal up correctly. So take those out. Next step, your fuel hose that goes to that canister style fuel filter comes right to your primer pump. You will use, on this particular truck, we have a 7/8 wrench, and you're going to take that hose off. Once this hose is removed, you're going to take your funnel, put your nitrile gloves on so you don't get fuel all over your hands, and put the funnel inside the fuel hose. You're going to start adding fuel into this fuel line, and you're going to be looking on top of this fuel filter element. You'll start, as this filter element fills, you'll start having fuel purge out that Schrader valve. And initially you're going to have some air bubbles, just let it work out. And then when you start seeing just diesel fuel with no air, now it's time to take that Schrader valve, put the Schrader valve back inside this valve stem cap, put it on, tighten it up, put the valve stem cap back on, and once that's complete, you're done on the fuel filter side of things down here. Next, you'll still have this fuel line unhooked, and you're going to put the funnel, you'll grab this line, again, you'll add more fuel, and you're going to want to make sure that this line's completely filled all the way to the top of the line. You can't add any more fuel. Once you get to that point, you're going to hook up this fuel line and snug it up. Next step, again, if you ran out of fuel, you ran the fuel water separator spin-on filter out of fuel. So we're going to need to prime that. Assuming your primer pump is good, we're going to use this step. If it's not good, if you're not getting any prime, or if this thing's just puking oil, diesel fuel out of it, you're going to have to use a ratchet strap, take this filter off, and pre-fill that with fuel to get the truck going. But again, ideally, you want to use your primer pump to pre-fill this filter with fuel naturally, so it's cleaning the fuel. You're not bypassing the filter with that dirty fuel filling it up. So we've got a banjo fitting right back here. You can see there's two different style of bolts these trucks will have. You can either have a 10mm bolt or a 12mm bolt on the back of this banjo fitting. This particular truck has a 10mm bolt. So you're going to take this, you don't have to loosen it very much, but you're going to loosen it slightly, and that will allow you to bleed air out of this fuel filter element when you're priming it with fuel. So you're going to start priming. Then what you're going to look for is diesel fuel. Eventually, as this gets filled, diesel fuel is going to start puking out of this banjo fitting, and you'll see bubbles initially. And as soon as those bubbles dissipate to where it's straight diesel fuel, you can snug this line back up, and then you'll just prime it again. Normally it's probably 75 to 100 pumps to fill everything and get everything primed. Depending on where you are with your truck, if you're in a quiet situation, you can listen for a slight click at your at this fitting right here. You'll hear a slight clicking, and that tells you that the fuel system is completely primed. If you're on the side of the I-70 or wherever, naturally it's going to be hard to hear that with road noise. But again, open this banjo fitting, let the fuel come out. Once the bubbles dissipate, snug that back up, probably give it another 15, 20 pumps, make sure everything's primed, and then go into the truck, give it about a half foot throttle, and start cranking, and it should fire off. That's going to be the main steps. Now, if for some reason you get into a situation where you even have to prime it further at the injection pump, what I just covered will cover 95% of priming situations, at least from our experience of having lots of these trucks. But there's a fitting on the back of this injection pump, and it's a 10 millimeter. It's going to be right back here, and you can also loosen that slightly and bleed air out of that fitting as well. My personal experience, you normally don't have to do it at this location. If you just do the banjo fitting right here on the back of your fuel water separator, you're typically good for priming your fuel system. So give that a whirl. Hook up your fuel line with fuel, prime it, and you should be good to go.